I was sitting in my workshop on a Tuesday afternoon when I heard the doorbell ring 3 times in rapid succession. The kind of aggressive ringing that tells you someone is already angry before you even open the door. I set down the chair leg I had been sanding and walked through my garage to the front entrance of my house in Beaverton, Oregon, wiping sawdust off my hands. Through the frosted glass panel, I could make out a stocky silhouette tapping her foot impatiently. Opening the door, I found myself face to face with Brenda Hutchins, the president of our homeowners association, and arguably the most insufferable person I had ever met in my 38 years of life. She stood there in her typical uniform of khaki capris and a purple fleece vest, clutching her ever-present clipboard like it was some kind of holy relic that granted her divine authority over the neighborhood. "Good afternoon, Brenda," I said, keeping my tone neutral. My name is Jake Patterson, and I had learned over the past 2 years of living in Meadowbrook Estates that showing any emotion around Brenda was like throwing gasoline on a fire. "Mr. Patterson," she snapped, not bothering with pleasantries, "I received a complaint about your garage." I leaned against the doorframe, genuinely confused. My garage was probably the most organized space in the entire neighborhood. I ran a small furniture restoration business from home, and I kept everything meticulously arranged. "A complaint about what exactly?" She thrust a finger past me toward the open garage door. "That," she declared dramatically, pointing at my propane heater sitting in the corner of my workspace. "That is a violation of Section 12. Subsection D of the HOA bylaws regarding fire hazards and unapproved heating devices." I followed her pointing finger to my industrial propane heater, a perfectly legal and safe unit I had purchased 3 months ago when the temperatures started dropping. Oregon winters were not brutal by northern standards, but they got cold enough that working in an unheated garage became unbearable. The heater was a Mr. Heater Big Buddy, rated for indoor use, with all the proper safety features including automatic shut-off and oxygen depletion sensors. "Brenda, that heater is completely safe. It is designed for indoor use and meets all safety codes. I need it to work in my garage during winter." Her eyes narrowed behind her wire-rimmed glasses. "The HOA does not permit propane devices in garages. It is a fire hazard and a liability concern. You have 48 hours to remove it, or you will face daily fines of $100. You cannot be serious. How am I supposed to heat my workshop?" "That is not my concern, Mr. Patterson. The rules exist for everyone's safety. Electric heaters are permitted, though they must be OL-listed and cannot exceed certain wattage limits." She flipped through pages on her clipboard. "Per Section 12, subsection F, electric space heaters are limited to 1,500 watts. I felt my jaw tighten. A 1,500-watt electric heater would not heat a space this size adequately. My garage is nearly 600 square feet. That propane heater is rated for up to 450 square feet, and even that barely keeps the temperature comfortable when it is 30 degrees outside." "Then perhaps you should consider wearing warmer clothing while you work," Brenda said with a patronizing smile that made my blood pressure spike. "The notice is official, 48 hours. She turned on her heel and marched back down my driveway before I could formulate a response that would not get me in even more trouble. I stood there watching her climb into her white Honda CR-V with the HOA board vanity plate, feeling that familiar mixture of frustration and disbelief that every interaction with Brenda produced. This was the same woman who had previously cited me for having my trash cans visible from the street for more than 2 hours after pickup. For painting my front door a shade of blue she claimed was not on the approved color palette despite it being Forest Evening Blue number 47, which was clearly listed. and for allegedly allowing my lawn to exceed the maximum permitted grass height of 3 inches by what she claimed was a 1/4 inch. I walked back into my garage and looked at the heater. It was currently off since the afternoon was relatively mild, but I knew I would need it come evening. I had a commission to finish, a set of 6 dining chairs that needed to be completely refinished by the end of the week, and there was no way I could work in sub-freezing temperatures. Pulling out my phone, I called my buddy Marcus, who had lived in Meadowbrook Estates for 5 years longer than I had. He answered on the 3rd ring. "Let me guess," Marcus said before I could even speak. "Brenda, how did you know? Because she is on a rampage today. She hit up 3 houses on Maple Drive this morning about various violations." "What did she get you for?" "My propane heater in the garage. She is claiming it violates the HOA bylaws." Marcus let out a low whistle. "Man, that is rough. What are you going to do?" "I am going to check the actual bylaws first. Brenda has a history of interpreting rules in whatever way suits her agenda." "Smart. Let me know if you need backup at the next HOA meeting. I still owe her for that nonsense about my patio furniture being the wrong color." After hanging up with Marcus, I went inside and dug out the massive binder of HOA documentation I had received when I purchased the house. The bylaws were supposedly available online, but the HOA website had not been updated since 2019, and half the links were broken. I flipped through page after page of mind-numbing legalese until I found Section 12. Reading through subsection D, I felt my frustration mount. The section mentioned open flame devices and unapproved heating systems, but was vague enough to be interpreted a dozen different ways. There was nothing specifically prohibiting propane heaters, especially not ones designed with modern safety features. The language seemed to be aimed more at preventing people from using things like kerosene heaters or jury-rigged heating systems. I spent the next hour researching Oregon fire codes, safety regulations, and HOA authority limits. What I discovered was interesting. While HOAs had broad authority to regulate aesthetic and some safety matters, they could not actually prohibit something that was legally permitted by state and local codes, unless they had a very specific and reasonable justification. My propane heater was legal under Oregon Fire Code, approved for indoor use by the manufacturer, and presented no greater risk than any other heating device. Armed with this information, I drafted a formal response to the HOA, citing the relevant codes and requesting a hearing before the board to discuss the matter. I printed it out, scanned it for my records, and drove it over to Brenda's house to deliver it personally. She was not home, so I left it in her mailbox with a note indicating the date and time of delivery. 2 days passed with no response. The temperature dropped significantly on the second night, falling to 26 degrees. I used my propane heater as usual, working late into the evening to finish the detailed spindle work on the dining chairs. Around 9 o'clock, I heard footsteps in my driveway. Looking up from my work, I saw Brenda standing at the entrance to my garage with her phone raised, taking pictures of my heater while it was running. Behind her stood 2 other HOA board members, Patricia Vance, the secretary, and Donald Morrison, the treasurer. "Good evening," I said, setting down my sandpaper. "Can I help you?" "You were notified to remove this device," Brenda said, continuing to take photos. "You are now in violation and subject to fines." I submitted a formal response challenging the violation. "I have not received any reply to my hearing request. Your request is denied. The board has reviewed your objection and found it without merit. You are being fined $100 per day starting yesterday. That is $200 currently owed." I stood up and walked closer to the group. "On what grounds are you denying my hearing?" The bylaws clearly state that any homeowner has the right to appear before the board to contest a violation. Patricia, a mousy woman in her 50s who rarely spoke up against Brenda, glanced nervously at her clipboard. The board has the authority to deny frivolous hearing requests. There is nothing frivolous about challenging a vague rule that potentially violates state fire codes. I am using a legally approved heating device in my own garage. Brenda stepped forward, her face flushed with anger or cold, I could not tell which. Mr. Patterson, you seem to think you are special, that the rules do not apply to you. Well, I am here to inform you that they do. Every homeowner in this community agreed to abide by these bylaws when they purchased their property. If you did not want to follow the rules, you should not have bought here. I have no problem following reasonable rules, Brenda. But this is not reasonable. This is arbitrary and overreaching. The fine stands. If the heater is not removed by tomorrow morning, the daily fines will continue. Additionally, if you continue to use it, we will consider it a repeated violation and the fines will double. She turned to leave, then paused. Oh, and Mr. Patterson. We will be conducting regular inspections to ensure compliance. Good night. The three of them walked away, leaving me standing in my garage, shaking with anger. I went inside and sat at my kitchen table, trying to calm down and think rationally. The situation was absurd, but I needed to approach it strategically, not emotionally. I spent the next morning consulting with a real estate attorney named Catherine Reynolds who specialized in HOA disputes. Her office was in downtown Portland, and I took the 40-minute drive to meet with her in person. Catherine was a sharp woman in her early 40s who listened carefully as I explained the situation. She reviewed the bylaws, my letter, and the photos I had taken of Brenda's visit. They are overreaching, she said finally. But here is the problem. Fighting an HOA is expensive and time-consuming. Even if you are completely in the right, which I believe you are, you could spend thousands in legal fees and months in dispute. HOAs know this, and they use it to bully homeowners into compliance. So what are my options? You can pay the fines and comply. You can continue fighting through their internal process and hope they see reason, or you can file a lawsuit. There is also the option of simply ignoring them and forcing them to take legal action, but that is risky. If they take legal action, what happens? They could place a lien on your property for unpaid fines. Eventually, they could even foreclose, though that is rare and would require the fines to accumulate substantially. More likely, they would take you to small claims court. I rubbed my temples, feeling a headache forming. This is insane, all over a heater. HOA disputes often are. The problem is that people like Brenda get a small amount of power and let it go to their heads. They interpret every rule in the strictest possible way and make life miserable for everyone around them. Catherine leaned back in her chair. If you want my advice, here is what I would do. Comply for now, but document everything. File formal complaints about harassment and arbitrary enforcement. Request copies of any complaints against you. Start building a case that shows a pattern of unreasonable behavior. Then, when you have enough evidence, you can either push for her removal from the board or file a lawsuit with a much stronger position. I left her office feeling deflated but more informed. The drive back to Beaverton felt longer than usual, and when I arrived home, there was an envelope taped to my front door. Inside was a formal violation notice and a bill for $200 in fines. That evening, I disconnected my propane heater and stored it in my basement. I purchased a 1,500-watt electric heater and set it up in my garage, knowing full well it would be inadequate. When I turned it on and tried to work, the difference was immediately apparent. The small electric heater barely took the edge off the cold, and my fingers quickly became too stiff to do detailed work. I lasted about an hour before I had to go inside to warm up. This was going to be impossible. I had deadlines to meet, and I could not work in these conditions. But I also could not afford to rack up hundreds or thousands of dollars in HOA fines. The next day was Saturday, and I attended the monthly HOA meeting held in the community center at the entrance to our neighborhood. About 30 residents were present, a decent turnout by usual standards. Brenda sat at the front table with Patricia and Donald, along with the other two board members, Helen Cross and Robert Jenkins. The meeting began with the usual mundane business: budget reviews, landscaping updates, and a discussion about repainting the community center trim. Then came the homeowner concerns section. I raised my hand. Brenda looked directly at me but called on someone else first, an older woman who wanted to complain about teenagers skateboarding in the street. After that discussion wrapped up, Brenda reluctantly acknowledged me. "Yes, Mr. Patterson." I stood up. "I want to address the recent violation I received regarding my garage heater. I believe the enforcement of this particular bylaw is unreasonable and potentially in conflict with state fire codes. I have submitted a formal challenge and requested a hearing, which was denied. I would like to know why my request for due process was rejected." Brenda's expression hardened. "Your request was reviewed by the board and found to be frivolous. The bylaw is clear and you were in violation. The matter is closed. With all due respect, the matter is not closed. I am a homeowner here, and I have a right to be heard by this board. The bylaw in question is vague and does not specifically prohibit the type of device I was using. I am requesting that this board review the language and consider a more reasonable interpretation." Several other homeowners murmured in agreement. Marcus, sitting 3 rows behind me, spoke up. "I think Jake has a point. I read through Section 12 after hearing about this, and it is pretty unclear. Are we banning all propane devices? What about propane grills? A lot of us have those." Brenda's face flushed red. "Outdoor grills are covered under a different section and are permitted in designated areas. This is about garage safety." Another homeowner, a man named Frank who lived 2 streets over, raised his hand. "Why is propane specifically a problem if it is a device designed for indoor use? I have an electric heater in my garage, but I know those can be fire hazards too, if they are not used properly." "Because the board has determined that propane presents an unacceptable risk," Brenda said, her voice rising. "We have a responsibility to protect property values and ensure safety in this community." I remained standing. "Then, I would like to request that the board provide documentation of any incidents involving propane heaters in residential garages in this community, or any similar communities, that justify this interpretation. I would also like to request that an independent fire safety inspector review the bylaw language and provide an assessment." "That is unnecessary and expensive," Brenda snapped. "The board's decision is final." "Actually," a quiet voice said from the front table. Everyone turned to look at Robert Jenkins, the newest board member who rarely spoke at meetings. He was a retired engineer in his 60s who had joined the board only 6 months ago. "Actually, I do not think we properly discussed this as a full board. Brenda brought it up in an email thread, but we never had a formal vote on how to interpret this section or how to handle Jake's challenge." Brenda shot him a look that could have melted steel. "We discussed it thoroughly." "No, we did not. You stated your interpretation, and when I raised some questions, you said it was not up for debate." Robert looked around at the other board members. "Did any of the rest of you feel like we had a proper discussion about this?" Patricia and Donald remained silent, but Helen, A retired teacher nodded slowly. I did think it was rushed. I wanted to look at the actual device Jake was using and get more information, but we never did that. Brenda slammed her hand on the table. Fine. We will schedule a special board meeting to discuss this matter. But until that meeting takes place, the violation stands and the fines continue. That is not fair, Marcus called out. You cannot keep fining him while the board figures out if the rule even applies. The violation has been issued. It stands until resolved. Brenda looked around the room with a challenging expression. Is there any other business? The meeting continued for another 20 minutes, but I barely paid attention. I was too busy calculating how much this delay would cost me and wondering if Brenda was deliberately dragging this out to rack up fines. A week passed before the special board meeting was scheduled. During that time, the temperature dropped even further, and we had an unusual cold snap that brought nighttime temperatures down into the teens. My inadequate electric heater was essentially useless, and I fell behind on my work. I had to contact my client and ask for an extension on the dining chairs, which was embarrassing and unprofessional. On the night before the special board meeting, the weather forecast predicted a major winter storm moving in from Alaska. They were calling for temperatures to drop below zero with wind chill, along with several inches of snow and ice. For Oregon, this was practically apocalyptic. People rushed to grocery stores to stock up, and the local news was filled with warnings about frozen pipes and power outages. The storm hit hard and fast. By Thursday evening, the temperature had plummeted to 8 degrees, and snow was falling heavily. The special board meeting was canceled due to weather, which meant the issue would not be resolved until the following week at the earliest. Friday morning, I woke to a freezing house. My heat was running, but my home's heating system was struggling to keep up with the extreme cold. I checked the thermostat. It was only 62 degrees inside despite being set to 70. I went out to my garage to check on my workshop and found it was barely above freezing. If I wanted to get any work done, I would need real heat. I stood there in my garage, looking at the inadequate electric heater and thinking about the propane heater sitting in my basement. The fine was now up to $800 and climbing. But I had work to do and I was in my own home, using a perfectly safe and legal device. I made a decision. I went downstairs, retrieved my propane heater and set it back up in my garage. I fired it up and felt the wonderful warmth begin to spread through the space. If Brenda wanted to fine me more, so be it. I would deal with that battle later, but I was not going to freeze in my own garage. What I did not anticipate was just how badly the storm would affect the rest of the neighborhood. By Friday afternoon, my phone started buzzing with messages in the neighborhood Facebook group. People were reporting that their heat was inadequate, their pipes were at risk of freezing, and some homes were having issues with their electrical systems being overloaded by space heaters. Several people mentioned that their garages were so cold that anything stored there was at risk of damage from freezing. Marcus texted me directly. My garage is an icebox. How are you managing with just that little electric heater? I hesitated before responding, then decided to be honest. I am using my propane heater. I am not freezing because of some arbitrary rule. His response was immediate. Smart. I am thinking about getting one myself. This is ridiculous. By Saturday morning, the neighborhood was in crisis. The temperature had dropped to 2 degrees overnight, and several families reported that their heat had failed completely. The local utility company was overwhelmed with service calls, and response times were stretching into days. People were desperate to stay warm. Brenda sent out an emergency email to all residents outlining cold, weather safety tips, and reminding everyone that only approved heating devices were permitted per HOA bylaws. The tone-deaf timing of the reminder did not go unnoticed. People started responding to the email thread, and the responses ranged from frustrated to outright angry. One person wrote, "My family is freezing and you are worried about HOA rules right now. Give me a break." Another, "I am going to buy whatever heater I need to keep my kids warm. Fine me if you want." Brenda responded with increasingly defensive messages about safety and liability, but she was losing the room. People were scared and cold, and her rigid adherence to rules was making her look heartless. Then things took an interesting turn. On Saturday afternoon, I was working in my warm garage when I heard a knock. Opening the side door, I found my neighbor from across the street, Susan Carlisle, standing there with her 2 young children. "Jake, I am so sorry to bother you, but our heat is out and we cannot get a repair person until Monday at the earliest. The kids are freezing. Can we sit in your garage for a while to warm up? I saw that you have some kind of heater running." I immediately opened the door wider. "Of course, come in. Do you need anything? Water, blankets?" Susan looked like she might cry from relief. "Just some warmth, thank you." I brought out folding chairs and set them up near the heater. Her kids, maybe 7 and 9 years old, huddled close to the heat source, their cheeks red from cold. Susan explained that their furnace had given out completely, and they had been trying to heat their house with just their oven and a couple of small space heaters, which was not remotely adequate. "Why not go to a hotel?" I asked. "Everything within 30 miles is booked solid." Everyone had the same idea. "We have been rotating who sleeps near the heaters at night, but it is miserable." She looked around my garage. "It is so warm in here. What kind of heater is that?" "It is a propane heater, the kind Brenda banned me from using." Susan's eyes widened. "The one you got fined for, but this is amazing. This is the kind of heat we need." Over the next hour, word somehow spread that my garage was warm. 3 more neighbors showed up asking if they could warm up for a bit. I found myself running an impromptu warming station, rotating people through so everyone could thaw out. It was absurd and dystopian, but it was also necessary. By Sunday, my garage had become the unofficial neighborhood refuge. I kept the space open from 8 in the morning until 10 at night, letting people come and go as needed. Some people brought coffee and snacks to share. Others brought blankets and pillows, camping out for hours. It became a community gathering place born out of desperation. Marcus came by on Sunday afternoon and pulled me aside. "You know Brenda is going to lose her mind when she finds out about this, right? Let her. People are freezing. What am I supposed to do, turn them away? I am not saying you should. I am just warning you that this is going to get ugly." He was right. On Monday morning, as the storm finally started to ease and temperatures began to climb back to a more reasonable 25 degrees, I received a certified letter from the HOA. It was a formal legal notice informing me that I was in continuing violation of the bylaws, that my fines now totaled $1,300, and that if I did not cease the violation immediately and pay all outstanding fines within 10 days, the HOA would place a lien on my property and pursue legal action. The letter also included a new violation: operating a business or public gathering place from my residence without approval, which apparently was prohibited under Section 8 of the bylaws. Brenda was hitting me from every angle she could think of. I was sitting at my kitchen table reading the letter for the 3rd time when my doorbell rang. This time it was not Brenda, but a local news reporter named Amy Cho from the Portland ABC affiliate. "Mr. Patterson, I am Amy Cho with Channel 8 News. I have been hearing stories from your neighbors about how you have been helping people stay warm during the cold snap. Would you be willing to talk to us about it? I was surprised but figured why not. Sure, come in. Amy and her cameraman set up in my living room, and she interviewed me about the situation. I explained the HOA dispute, the inadequacy of electric heaters during extreme cold, and how I had ended up running an impromptu warming station for neighbors in need. She seemed genuinely interested and took notes carefully. "You have permission to film my garage and talk to some of the neighbors who were here?" I asked. "We have been talking to people already. That is how we heard about you. Several of your neighbors are very grateful and very angry at your HOA for trying to stop you from using an effective heater." The story aired that evening on the 6 o'clock news. I watched it with a mixture of pride and dread. The segment was about 3 minutes long and painted a clear picture. Unreasonable HOA president enforces arbitrary rule while neighbors freeze. Homeowner defies rule to help community. Now faces massive fines and legal action. They interviewed Susan, who spoke emotionally about her children being cold and Jake's garage being a lifesaver. They interviewed Marcus, who called the HOA's enforcement bureaucratic insanity. And they showed footage of my propane heater, with the safety features clearly visible, while the reporter explained that it was legal under state fire codes. The segment ended with a shot of Brenda's house and a voiceover. We reached out to HOA President Brenda Hutchins for comment, but she declined to speak with us. The HOA board has not responded to questions about whether they will reconsider their enforcement of this rule. My phone exploded with calls and texts. Friends from other parts of the state saw the story. My sister called from California. Even my client, who was waiting for the dining chairs, reached out to say she had seen the news and completely understood the delay. The story also hit social media hard. By Tuesday morning, it had been picked up by several news aggregation sites and was trending on local Reddit forums. People were outraged at the HOA, supportive of me, and sharing their own HOA horror stories. The attention was overwhelming. What I did not expect was the impact it would have on the HOA itself. By Tuesday afternoon, a group of about 15 homeowners had organized a petition calling for a special election to recall Brenda from the board presidency. The petition cited abuse of authority, arbitrary enforcement, lack of transparency, and failure to act in the best interests of the community. Marcus called me Tuesday evening. "Dude, you are famous. Also, Helen and Robert from the board want to meet with you tomorrow. Unofficially, off the record, just to talk." I met Helen and Robert at a coffee shop in downtown Beaverton on Wednesday morning. Both of them looked tired and stressed. Helen spoke first. "Jake, we want you to know that not everyone on the board agrees with how Brenda has handled this. Robert and I both think she has overstepped, and we are not comfortable with the fines or the threats." Robert nodded. "The problem is that Brenda controls the board agenda and the communication with our HOA lawyer. Patricia and Donald basically rubber stamp whatever she wants. Helen and I are outvoted on almost everything." "So what can you do?" I asked. "We are supporting the recall effort," Helen said quietly. "We cannot say that publicly yet because it would create immediate conflict, but we think it is necessary. Brenda has become toxic, and she is damaging the community." "In the meantime," Robert added, "we wanted to give you a heads up that Brenda is planning to escalate things. She is furious about the news coverage and blames you for making the HOA look bad. She is talking about pursuing the maximum penalties and even trying to get an injunction to force you to stop using the heater immediately. She is that vindictive. You have no idea," Helen said. "She has been like this for years, but she has gotten worse. The power has gone to her head, and anyone who challenges her becomes her enemy." Armed with this information, I decided it was time to go fully on the offensive. I contacted Catherine Reynolds again and told her I wanted to pursue legal action against the HOA. She agreed to take the case and began drafting a lawsuit alleging harassment, arbitrary enforcement, and improper denial of due process. The recall petition gained momentum quickly. Within a week, it had over 100 signatures, well more than the threshold needed to trigger a special election. The petition was formally submitted to the HOA board on a Thursday, which meant they were required to schedule a vote within 30 days. Brenda's response was to double down. She sent out a mass email to all homeowners defending her actions and characterizing the recall effort as an attack by a small group of malcontents who wanted to flout the rules. She portrayed herself as the defender of property values and community standards. The email was so over the top and self-righteous that it actually backfired, convincing several people who had been on the fence to support the recall. The special election was scheduled for 3 weeks later, to be held on a Saturday at the community center. In the interim, Brenda continued to send me violation notices and fine assessments. The total was now over $2,000. She also sent notices to neighbors who had been coming to my garage, warning them that participating in an unapproved gathering was also a violation. That particular move was so petty and mean-spirited that it generated even more backlash. During this time, the weather began to moderate, and life in the neighborhood started returning to normal. Furnaces were repaired, power systems stabilized, and people no longer needed my garage as a warming station. But the damage to Brenda's reputation was done. She had shown her true colors during a crisis, and people did not forget. The lawsuit Catherine filed on my behalf sought an injunction against the HOA's enforcement actions, a refund of all fines collected, and damages for harassment and emotional distress. The HOA's lawyer, a bored-looking man named Gregory Stone, filed a response dismissing all claims and arguing that the HOA had absolute authority to interpret and enforce its bylaws. The legal battle was just beginning, but I felt like I finally had some leverage. What I did not anticipate was how far Brenda would go to retaliate. On a Tuesday evening, about a week before the recall election, I came home from running errands to find 2 police cars in my driveway. My heart sank as I pulled up and parked on the street. 2 Beaverton police officers were standing by my garage door talking to Brenda. I approached cautiously. "Officers, what is going on?" The older of the 2 officers, a sergeant named Williams based on his name tag, turned to me. "Are you Jake Patterson?" "Yes, that is me." "We received a report of illegal business operations and potential fire code violations at this address. We need to inspect your garage." I looked at Brenda, who was standing there with her arms crossed and a satisfied expression on her face. "You called the police." "I am simply ensuring that code enforcement is taken seriously," she said primly. I turned back to Sergeant Williams. "Officers, I run a legal home-based furniture restoration business. I have all the proper permits and licenses. As for fire code violations, I have been using a propane heater that is rated for indoor use and meets all safety standards. This is a dispute with my HOA, not a criminal matter." The sergeant looked tired, like he had dealt with this kind of nonsense before. "Do you mind if we take a look?" "Not at all." I opened my garage door and let them inspect. They looked at the propane heater, checked the ventilation, and examined my workspace. The younger officer even took photos with his phone. After about 10 minutes, Sergeant Williams came back over. "Mr. Patterson, everything here looks fine. The heater is approved for indoor use, you have adequate ventilation, and your workspace meets safety standards. As for the business operations, That is a zoning and permit issue, not a police matter, and it appears you have the proper documentation." He turned to Brenda. "Madam, this does not constitute an emergency or a criminal violation. If you have an HOA dispute, you need to handle it through civil channels, not by calling 911. Brenda's face turned red. "But he is in violation of community rules." "That is not a police matter, madam. Please do not call emergency services for civil disputes. You are wasting city resources." The officers left, and Brenda stood in my driveway glaring at me. "You think you have won, but you have not. I will not let you make a mockery of this community's rules." "Brenda, this has gone way too far. People were freezing, and you were more concerned about enforcing an arbitrary rule than about their well-being. That is why people want you gone. Those people are idiots who do not understand what it takes to maintain a quality community. Someone has to enforce standards, and if that makes me unpopular, so be it. There is a difference between enforcing reasonable standards and being a tyrant. You have crossed that line, and now you are going to face consequences." She stepped closer, her voice dropping to a hiss. "I have been running this HOA for 6 years. I have protected property values and maintained order. You are a troublemaker who has been here less than 2 years, and you think you can undermine everything I have built. You are wrong." "Let the homeowners decide that," I said calmly, though my heart was racing. "The election is in a few days." She turned and walked away without another word. I stood there feeling shaken. The police visit had been a blatant attempt at intimidation, and I realized that Brenda was not going to stop until she either destroyed me or I destroyed her. The next few days were tense. I focused on preparing for the recall election and working with Catherine on the lawsuit. The neighborhood buzz was intense, with people taking sides and arguing on social media. The vast majority seemed to support the recall, but Brenda had her defenders, mostly older residents who valued order and authority and saw the recall as a dangerous precedent. On the Thursday before the election, something unexpected happened. Patricia Vance, the HOA secretary, resigned from the board. She sent out an email announcing her resignation effective immediately and stating that she could no longer in good conscience support the board's direction. She did not mention Brenda by name, but everyone knew what she meant. This was significant because Patricia had been one of Brenda's closest allies. Her departure suggested that even Brenda's inner circle was crumbling. Marcus texted me, "This is it. She is finished." The recall election was held on Saturday at 2 in the afternoon. Nearly 200 homeowners showed up, an unprecedented turnout. The community center was packed, and people spilled out into the parking lot. The tension in the air was palpable. The election was conducted by secret ballot. Helen Cross, as the senior remaining board member after Patricia's resignation, oversaw the process. Each homeowner was given a ballot with a simple yes or no question. Should Brenda Hutchins be removed from her position as HOA president? The counting took about an hour. During that time, people milled around talking in nervous clusters. Brenda sat at the front of the room looking defiant, flanked by Donald Morrison and 2 of her supporter friends. I stayed in the back with Marcus, Susan, and several other neighbors. Finally, Helen stood up and called for everyone's attention. The room fell silent. She looked down at the paper in her hands and then looked up at the crowd. The results of the recall election are as follows. Total votes cast, 183. Yes votes in favor of recall, 147. No votes against recall, 36. By an overwhelming margin, the recall is successful. Brenda Hutchins is hereby removed from her position as HOA president effective immediately. The room erupted in applause and cheers. I saw Brenda's face go pale, then red. She stood up and grabbed her purse. This is a mistake. You are all making a huge mistake. This community is going to fall apart without proper leadership." She stormed out of the community center, leaving Donald and her supporters sitting there looking shell-shocked. Helen waited for the noise to die down. As the senior board member, I will assume the role of acting president until a special election can be held to fill the position. In the meantime, we will be reviewing all current enforcement actions and fines to ensure they were appropriate and consistent with the bylaws. People came up to me afterward to congratulate me and express their relief. Susan hugged me. Marcus clapped me on the back. Even people I had never spoken to before came over to thank me for standing up to Brenda. It felt surreal and overwhelming. The following week, the HOA board held an emergency meeting to address the backlog of issues that had been ignored during the crisis. Helen announced that my fines were being rescinded in full, and that the board was going to form a committee to review and clarify the bylaws regarding heating devices and other safety equipment. Robert Jenkins volunteered to chair that committee. The language of Section 12, Subsection D, was revised to specifically permit approved indoor-use propane heaters, provided they met certain clearly defined safety standards. The new language was clear, reasonable, and based on actual fire codes rather than arbitrary interpretation. It passed unanimously, including a yes vote from Donald Morrison, who seemed chastened by the entire experience. Catherine's lawsuit was settled out of court. The HOA agreed to pay my legal fees, issue a formal apology, and make policy changes to ensure better due process for homeowners challenging violations. It was not a huge financial victory for me, but it was a moral one, and it set important precedents for how the HOA would operate going forward. Brenda did not go quietly into the night, however. In the weeks after her removal, she sent multiple angry emails to the neighborhood list, ranting about the decline of standards and predicting chaos. Most people ignored her or blocked her. Eventually, the board removed her from the community email list for harassment, which only made her angrier. Then, about 6 weeks after the recall, things took a darker turn. I was working in my garage on a Thursday afternoon when Sergeant Williams showed up at my door again, this time alone. "Mr. Patterson, I need to ask you some questions about Brenda Hutchins." My stomach tightened. "What about her? Have you had any contact with her since the recall election?" "No, none. I have been avoiding her deliberately." "Why?" He pulled out a notepad. "She has filed multiple complaints against you with the police department, the fire marshal's office, the city zoning department, and the state contractors licensing board. She is claiming everything from fire hazards to business violations to fraud. We have investigated every complaint and they are all baseless, but she keeps filing them. I felt a mixture of anger and concern, so she is just harassing me through official channels. It appears that way. The problem is that filing false reports and making false statements to government agencies is a crime. We have warned her twice to stop, but she filed another complaint yesterday. This time she claimed you were running an unlicensed daycare center out of your home, which obviously makes no sense." He looked at me seriously. "We are going to charge her with filing false reports and harassment. I wanted to give you a heads up and see if you had any documentation of her behavior that might be relevant." I told him about the threats, the escalating fines, the police call during the storm, and the emails. He took notes and asked me to forward any relevant emails or documents to the police department. "One more thing," he said. "Has she threatened you physically or made any statements about harming you or your property?" "Not directly, no. She has been hostile and vindictive, but no explicit threats." "Why?" "Because based on her behavior pattern, we are concerned she might escalate." Please be aware of your surroundings and let us know immediately if anything unusual happens. This was unsettling. I had thought the situation was winding down, but apparently Brenda was spiraling into something more serious. I thanked the sergeant and locked my doors that night, feeling uneasy. 2 days later, on Saturday morning, I was woken up at 6 o'clock by the sound of my fire alarm going off. I bolted out of bed and ran through the house, checking for smoke or flames. Finding nothing inside, I looked out the window toward my garage and saw smoke coming from under the door. I grabbed my phone and called 911, then ran outside in my pajamas and slippers. The garage side door was slightly ajar, which was wrong because I always kept it locked. I carefully pushed it open and saw smoke filling the space. My workbench was on fire, flames spreading across the wood surface and beginning to catch on the wall behind it. I ran back inside and grabbed my fire extinguisher, then returned to the garage and emptied it on the flames. The fire was small enough that I managed to knock it down before it spread too far, but the damage was done. My workbench was charred and destroyed. Several pieces of furniture I had been working on were ruined, and the wall was blackened and would need serious repair. The fire department arrived within 10 minutes, checked to make sure the fire was completely out, and investigated the scene. The fire inspector took one look at the burn pattern and the point of origin and called the police. Sergeant Williams arrived shortly after. This was arson, the inspector told him, showing him the evidence. There are traces of an accelerant here on the workbench, and the door lock shows signs of tampering. Someone broke in and deliberately set this fire. I felt cold despite the morning sun. Brenda. Sergeant Williams looked at me. Do you have any proof? No direct proof, but who else would do this? She has been escalating her harassment, and you said yourself you were worried she might do something worse. We will investigate. You have security cameras. I cursed myself silently. No, I kept meaning to install them but never got around to it. The police spent several hours documenting the scene and taking samples of the accelerant. They talked to neighbors to see if anyone had seen anything, but it was early morning and most people had been asleep. I called my insurance company and started the process of filing a claim. Later that afternoon, 2 detectives came to my house. They introduced themselves as Detective Karen Moss and Detective James Porter from the Beaverton Police Criminal Investigations Unit. They asked detailed questions about my history with Brenda, the HOA dispute, and the timeline of events. We have been building a case regarding Mrs. Hutchins's harassment campaign, Detective Moss said. The false reports, the escalating behavior, and now this fire. We have enough to get a search warrant for her home and vehicle. We are going to execute it tomorrow morning. Do you really think she did this? I asked. Based on the pattern of behavior and the circumstances, she is absolutely a suspect. We will know more after the search. The next morning, I heard through the neighborhood grapevine that police had shown up at Brenda's house with a search warrant. They were there for several hours, and neighbors reported seeing them carry out bags of evidence. By evening, the news had spread that Brenda had been arrested and charged with second-degree arson, second-degree criminal mischief, burglary, and multiple counts of making false reports. The evidence against her was damning. Police found an empty container in her garage that had contained the same type of accelerant used in the fire. They found receipts showing she had purchased it 2 days before the fire. They found notes and documents showing an obsessive focus on me, including printed copies of news articles about the HOA dispute with angry handwritten notes in the margins. Most damning, they found images on her phone showing my garage from multiple angles, taken at different times over the past few weeks, as if she had been surveilling and planning. When questioned, Brenda initially denied everything. But faced with the evidence, she eventually broke down and admitted that she had been so angry about losing her position and being humiliated that she wanted to punish me. She claimed she had only meant to damage my workshop equipment, not burn down the whole garage, as if that made it better. The legal process moved forward methodically. Brenda was released on bail but ordered to stay away from me and my property. The HOA board, now led by Helen with Robert as vice president, issued a statement condemning Brenda's actions and expressing full support for me. The neighborhood was in shock. Even people who had supported Brenda during the recall election were horrified by what she had done. My insurance covered the damage to my garage, and I spent the next few weeks rebuilding my workspace. Neighbors pitched in to help, with Marcus and Frank and several others donating time to help me repair the walls and rebuild the workbench. It became another community bonding experience, though I would have preferred different circumstances. The criminal case went to trial 6 months later. I testified about the HOA dispute and Brenda's escalating behavior. The investigators presented their evidence. The prosecution argued that Brenda had become so consumed with anger and a sense of wounded pride that she had committed a serious crime out of spite and vindictiveness. Brenda's defense attorney tried to paint her as a dedicated community servant who had suffered a mental breakdown under stress, but the jury was not buying it. After 3 days of testimony and only 2 hours of deliberation, they returned guilty verdicts on all counts. The judge was not sympathetic. During sentencing, he spoke directly to Brenda. "Mrs. Hutchins, you are entrusted with a position of responsibility in your community. Instead of accepting the democratic will of your neighbors when they chose to remove you from that position, you embarked on a campaign of harassment that culminated in arson. You endangered lives and destroyed property out of nothing more than petty vindictiveness. This court takes such conduct very seriously." He sentenced her to 4 years in state prison, with the possibility of parole after 2 years. She would also have to pay restitution for the damage to my garage, plus fines and court costs. She was led out of the courtroom in handcuffs, crying and protesting that it was too harsh. I felt no satisfaction watching it, only a sense of exhaustion and relief that it was finally over. The HOA moved forward under new leadership. Helen served as president for a full term and did an excellent job of healing the divisions in the community and implementing more transparent, reasonable governance. The bylaws were thoroughly reviewed and updated, with input from multiple homeowners and consultation with legal experts to ensure they were clear, fair, and enforceable. The propane heater rule was not only clarified, but became a symbol of the changes in the HOA culture. The board created a safety committee that reviewed all rules related to fire hazards and building codes, making sure they were based on actual safety concerns rather than arbitrary preferences. Several other rules that had been vague or overly restrictive were revised or eliminated. My furniture restoration business continued to grow. The publicity from the whole ordeal had actually brought me more clients, people who appreciated the story of someone standing up to unreasonable authority. I finished the dining chairs that had been delayed by all the drama, and my client was thrilled with them. She told everyone she knew about my work, and referrals started flowing in. The next winter, when temperatures dropped again, I used my propane heater without any hesitation or concern. Several of my neighbors had purchased similar heaters for their own garages and workshops, and no one gave them any trouble about it. We had learned an important lesson about the difference between reasonable rules and authoritarian control. Marcus and I became closer friends through the whole experience. We started a tradition of having a neighborhood barbecue every spring at the community center, a way of bringing people together and maintaining the sense of community that had emerged during the crisis. The events were always well attended and became something people looked forward to. Susan and her family stayed in the neighborhood, and her kids would sometimes come over to my garage to watch me work on furniture projects. I taught them some basic woodworking skills, and they made small items like birdhouses and picture frames. It was rewarding to pass on knowledge and see their excitement when they created something with their own hands. One evening, about a year after Brenda's sentencing, I was sitting in my garage with my propane heater running, putting the finishing touches on a beautiful oak table. Marcus stopped by with a 6-pack of beer, and we sat there talking about everything that had happened. "You know," he said, "this whole thing was insane, but I think something good came out of it. The neighborhood is better now. People are more engaged, the HOA is more reasonable, and we actually know our neighbors." I nodded, taking a sip of beer. "Yeah, I just wish it had not required someone losing their mind and committing arson to get there." "True, but you stood up for what was right when it mattered. A lot of people would have just backed down and paid the fines." "I was just tired of being pushed around by someone on a power trip." "I did not set out to become the face of HOA resistance." Marcus laughed. "Maybe not, but you did. And now you are the guy who beat the HOA and got warm while everyone else froze." We clinked our beer bottles together in a toast. Outside, the temperature was dropping toward freezing, but inside my garage it was perfectly comfortable. My propane heater hummed quietly in the corner, doing exactly what it was designed to do, keeping me warm while I worked. Looking back on the entire experience, I realized it had taught me several important lessons. First, that standing up for yourself is necessary even when it is difficult and costly. Second, that communities function best when leaders serve the people rather than their own egos. Third, that sometimes the most absurd conflicts can reveal deeper truths about authority, power, and resistance. And fourth, that a good heater is worth fighting for when the temperature drops below freezing. The HOA had tried to make me freeze. They had fined me, threatened me, and attempted to force me into compliance with an unreasonable rule. In the end, I stayed warm. They faced consequences for their overreach, and the community emerged stronger and more united. It was not the outcome anyone had predicted when Brenda first showed up at my door with her clipboard, but it was the outcome we needed. As I sat there in my warm garage with my friend, working on a beautiful piece of furniture and enjoying the simple comfort of adequate heat, I felt genuinely content. The battle had been exhausting and sometimes frightening, but I had come through it with my principles intact, my business thriving, and a newfound appreciation for the importance of standing firm against unreasonable authority. The propane heater continued to hum in the background, its steady warmth a reminder that sometimes the simplest acts of defiance, like refusing to freeze in your own garage, can spark changes that ripple through an entire community. Brenda had wanted to enforce control and maintain her power. Instead, she had lost everything and ended up in prison. Meanwhile, I was exactly where I wanted to be, warm, productive, and free to run my business and live my life without arbitrary interference. The story of the HOA's attempted heater ban became something of a legend in our neighborhood and even in the broader Portland area. Every so often, I would meet someone new who would ask if I was that guy who fought the HOA over the heater, and I would have to retell parts of the story. It became a cautionary tale about HOA overreach and a reminder that homeowners have rights that should not be trampled by petty bureaucrats. Eventually, things settled into a comfortable routine. The drama faded into the past, replaced by normal neighborhood life. Kids played in the streets, people mowed their lawns, and the HOA managed the common areas without causing anyone undue stress. It was exactly what a community association should be: helpful infrastructure that stayed in the background, not a domineering presence that made people's lives miserable. I continued to use my propane heater every winter, and every time I turned it on, I felt a small sense of victory. It was more than just a heating device now. It was a symbol of personal freedom, reasonable governance, and the power of community solidarity in the face of unreasonable authority. And on the coldest nights, when the temperature dropped and the wind howled outside, I would sit in my warm garage, perfectly comfortable, and remember the winter when the HOA tried to make me freeze and failed completely. The most satisfying part was knowing that Brenda, sitting in her prison cell, was probably thinking about how a simple propane heater had brought down her entire reign of petty tyranny. She had been so convinced of her own authority, so certain that she could bend everyone to her will, that she had never considered the possibility that someone would actually fight back effectively. Her downfall had been her own arrogance and vindictiveness, and while I took no pleasure in seeing anyone go to prison, I could not deny that justice had been served. In the end, the story was simple. An unreasonable HOA president tried to enforce an arbitrary rule during a winter storm. A homeowner refused to comply and helped his neighbors instead. The community rallied together, and the tyrant fell. It was almost mythic in its simplicity. A modern-day David and Goliath story set in a suburban Oregon neighborhood with propane heaters instead of slingshots. And every winter, when I fired up that heater and felt its warmth spread through my garage, I was reminded that sometimes the most important battles are fought over the smallest things, and that standing up for common sense and basic human decency is always worth the effort, no matter how powerful your opponent might seem.